Hey guys. So, as a result of us doing online learning and the massive impact that we're all feeling from the coronavirus epidemic, I've decided to do a series of weird histories on various global epidemics and pandemics, hopefully to help us think a little more historically, maybe a little more deeply about what we're experiencing right now. Um, Definitely, the coronavirus is going to be one of the biggest and weirdest events that we live through, hopefully. But epidemics are actually a pretty normal thing in world history. And so, in order to give us a little bit more context and maybe to help us think through some of this stuff, we're going to be looking at some other epidemics. And we'll be starting with the Black Death, possibly the deadliest natural disaster in human history. If you look at the image here, you'll see a emperor, a pope or bishop, and a noblewoman holding hands with a row of zombie-like corpses. This is a type of painting that became popular in Europe following the Black Death in the middle of the 1300s, known as the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. And this was painted all over the inside of churches and catacombs and places like that, showing just the total ubiquity, all presentness of death during this time period, where pretty much every single person had lost, um, you know, tens or dozens of people that they knew to the Black Death. The entire society was totally reshaped by this all-present and basically inexplicable disease. So let's take a look at that and how it affected European society. So the Black Death hit Europe between 1346 and 1353. It had been going on in Central Asia before that, but Europe was one of the places in the world hardest hit, the other place being China. This was by far the deadliest pandemic in European history. Somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people died around the world. We don't know for sure because record keeping wasn't that great in many parts of the world, so we have a wide range of estimates here. Uh, based on based on church records, though, in Europe, we have some pretty solid data. There's still some dispute, though, among historians about how many people died. On the low end, people are estimating about 30% of the European population died during these years. On the high end, people are estimating a death rate of around 60%. But either way, that's still just a completely massive death toll. Imagine 1/3 of the people you know currently dying within a 5-year span. It would be absolutely devastating and completely disruptive to current social norms and economic practices, and probably also disruptive to the way we think about ourselves and our lives. There were a lot of different responses to the Black Death, but one thing that happened was just a total breakdown in systems of giving care to people. The death rates were so massive, European societies were simply not set up to deal with this rate of death. You can see a painting there that comes from somewhere in France of people laying coffins into mass graves. Whole new areas had to be consecrated as cemeteries because the death rates were so massive that they filled up existing cemeteries. And archaeologists have begun excavating some of these mass graves, which you can see a picture of down there. We have a description of this coming from the early Renaissance writer Giovanni Boccaccio, whose home city of Florence was totally devastated by the Black Death. There's pretty clear records there showing about a 50% decline in the population of Florence from before to after the Black Death. And Boccaccio says this. He says, "The countless number of people who fell sick could look for help only to the charity of friends, and there were few of them, or to the avarice of servants who received huge salaries without being required to do much, and yet were still hard to find. It followed from this situation that many people died who might have lived if they had been cared for." So as we're seeing with the coronavirus, one of the biggest threats is not actually the disease itself, but the risk that the disease will overwhelm systems of care, and that people with moderate symptoms who might survive if they're cared for and, kept properly hydrated and fed, might die simply because there's not enough people around to take care of them. So that's one reason for the social distancing, is to make sure that the pandemic spreads slowly enough that way the people who do get sick can receive adequate care, rather than people simply being sick at home alone, dying. But so anyway, what caused the Black Death? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but I think it's really interesting to spend a minute looking at what the Europeans thought caused the Black Death. So in 1350, science was not very advanced. People had a very rudimentary understanding of the world, and they used these basic understandings of the world to construct explanations for why the Black Death was happening. The most common explanations went like this. First of all, many Europeans believed that the Black Death was simply a punishment coming from God. The Bible describes a number of plagues where God strikes people down with illnesses because they displeased God in some way. The most famous example of this comes from Exodus and the story of Moses in Egypt, where God continually strikes the Egyptians with a series of ever worsening plagues until the Egyptians let the Hebrews go out of slavery. So many people viewed this massive, inexplicable death as coming from an angry God, and so they took a number of religious responses to try and stop the suffering. Another explanation, and this one was the most popular among university professors, was that there was unclean air being released from the Earth because of the alignment of planets in the solar system. This unclean air was known as a miasma, and the professors of medicine argued that you could avoid getting the Black Death simply by avoiding smelling the miasmas. And last of all, within cities with significant Jewish populations, the Christian population blamed the Jews. And they said that the Jews were poisoning Christians in some sort of satanic plot. Right. So, based on these explanations, what could you do to avoid getting sick? Well, first of all, rich people had a really awesome option that Boccaccio describes, which is simply to take all your stuff and go live out in the countryside away from everybody else. And lots of rich people did this. Now, one cost of this is that by fleeing a plague-infected city, you also risk spreading the disease. Other people who didn't have the means to leave cities reacted in some pretty weird ways. Large groups of people reacted by having massive parties, and Boccaccio actually describes people breaking into rich people's houses and drinking all of their wine and having like bonfires in the streets and stuff. An opposite response was to become hyper-religious. People flocked to churches to pray for forgiveness and relief. And some people took this a step further and became what are known as flagellants. These people joined wandering bands of religious fanatics who would publicly whip themselves in the street until the street was just running with their blood. And they believed that by punishing themselves in ways similar to how Christ had been punished before the crucifixion, that they could make up for mankind's sins. The professors recommended, because the plague was caused by bad air, simply holding up a bouquet of flowers around your face. And some doctors started wearing these super creepy bird masks where they would stuff the beak with feathers, or not feathers, flowers. That way, when they were treating patients, they would smell the flowers instead of the disgusting stench of decaying bodies. And last of all, the people who believed that it was a Jewish plot responded by committing a series of genocides in which Jewish populations were rounded up and executed, usually through mass burnings, which you can see a picture of there. That, of course, has some really creepy connections to later events in European history. So those are all the things that they thought caused it, and of course none of these are correct. But what really did cause it? Turns out it's more complicated than a lot of people think. So the most common explanation is that it was caused by fleas on rats, and we'll get to that in a second. But there are some deeper long-term causes that also need to be looked at. First of all, the 1350s was a time period of increasing world trade made possible by the Mongol Empire. The Mongols had conquered all of pretty much all of Eurasia, and then enforced a peace known as the Pax Mongolica that allowed for trade to flourish during this time period. This connected large populations of people all around the continent and then allowed diseases to move between those people. So world trade is possibly one of the long-term causes of the Black Death and possibly of all pandemics. No world trade, no pandemics. Another problem is that European population was actually spiking during the 1200s and 1300s, during what is known as the High Middle Ages. What this meant is that as the population expanded, they were starting to run out of good farmland, and people were having to try and farm in swamps and on top of hills and stuff like that. And so rates of malnourishment were actually going up. Europeans were eating less and less, and malnourishment makes you more susceptible to pretty much every disease that's out there. So in a world with lots of world trade and lots of malnourishment, this is basically a perfect scenario for a pandemic. Now, what actually caused the pandemic? What was actually the spark that made it happen? So the most common answer is that it was caused by a bacteria known as Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas who lived on rats. And these rats kind of stowed along on wagons and ships and spread around with world trade. And so that's one possible explanation. There is, however, an ongoing controversy among professors as to what actually caused this. Some people argue that it was actually an outbreak of anthrax. Some people say that it was some other virus with symptoms very similar to Ebola. And some people suggest that it was some kind of super plague that combined Yersinia pestis with some other stuff. And that only some kind of super plague could have caused the massive mortality rates that we see in the Black Death. And I am not enough of an expert to be able to tell you which one of these is most plausible. I just want to let you know that it's complicated. So what were the symptoms? Most writers who describe the Black Death talk about terrible skin ailments, including rashes, swellings, and boils. The boils is what makes a lot of people think that it was the bubonic plague. There were also terrible fevers and vomiting of blood. And a death would usually come 2 to 7 days after showing symptoms. And the mortality rate was somewhere between 80 and 90%, which is just staggering. Now, so what would happen to a society where an inexplicable illness kills 1/3 to 2/3 of the whole population? Well, actually, weirdly enough, a lot of good stuff. First of all, and most importantly, is the living standards for the average European actually increase during this time period. Because a huge chunk of the population dies, that means the remaining people have access to much better farmland, which means that the amount of food and the productivity of farmers goes up. Also, this was really good for the surviving working class people. The peasants and artisans of Europe were actually able to demand higher wages because there were fewer people trying to get work. They were also able to demand various types of workers' rights or exemption from taxes. On top of that, we also see a lot of good stuff happening in the environment. There's massive reforestation in Europe because people don't have to farm bad farmland anymore and they just let the forest grow back. And that this possibly led to the Little Ice Age of the 1600s as carbon in the atmosphere was sucked up into these regrowing forests. And as far as cultural impacts go, this is harder to measure because, culture is mysterious and changes in weird ways. But some people have argued that the experience of the Black Death was deeply disorienting and that it led a lot of people to question their existing view of the world. Like, for example, if God caused the plague, why didn't praying and self-flagellating do anything about it? Or if the professors were right and it was caused by a miasma, why were the professors still getting sick and dying? And so some people argue that this led to an age of the questioning of authority and new perspectives that we call the Renaissance and the Reformation, basically kicking off modern European culture. I'm not sure I buy that, but it's worth knowing that some people do argue that that is the case. Now, so some people looking at these effects have actually argued that the Black Death in the long run wasn't actually such a bad thing. Most famously, the economist and historian Walter Schleidel argues that massive disruptions like the Black Death are actually a good thing for poor people because they increase equality. They reduce the privileges of rich people and allow poor people more opportunities. This argument was similarly made by Thanos in the Avengers. So anyway, that's all I've got time for today. Here are some reflection questions that I would like you to consider, and if you want to write on these for, you know, possible extra credit, you could definitely do that. All right, bye guys.